Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion about Virginia collective bargaining. My name's Sarah Miller Espinosa, and in a moment, I'm going to provide you with an overview of our session and then further introduce myself and our panelists, Justin Keating and Amy Smith. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first is, please write this on your calendar. Save the date for the Virginia LERA in-person third annual conference, which is going to happen on Tuesday, September 10th in Richmond. There'll be further information about that coming up, but you'll want to reserve the day. We also have a large number of people joining us here today, and so we'll just ask you, and I think this will happen automatically because we're using Spotlight, that you keep yourself on mute and then type your questions into the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat as we go along in this session and then raising those questions to Justin and Amy. So I'm going to start with our overview. As of May 2021, Virginia municipalities, counties, cities, and school divisions were permitted to adopt ordinances, counties and cities, or resolutions, that's what they call them at the school boards, enabling collective bargaining for municipal and school division employees. As many of you know, previous to the enabling legislation, public sector collective bargaining in Virginia was prohibited by state law. Since May 2021, several jurisdictions have adopted collective bargaining, including the counties of Arlington, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William, the cities of Alexandria, Charlottesville, and Richmond, and school divisions including Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, Montgomery, Prince William, and Richmond. Elections and negotiations have ensued. The first collective bargaining agreements were negotiated in Alexandria and Arlington and went into effect on July 1st, 2023. Several other jurisdictions have finished negotiating first contracts, most of which will be effective on July 1st. I should also mention that the various ordinances and resolutions include a variety of mechanisms in the event collective bargaining impasses, including in the event of collective bargaining impasses, including interest arbitration or fact-finding and or mediation, and that many jurisdictions have adopted a model where a labor relations administrator, a neutral arbitrator, is contracted with to oversee elections, resolve negotiability disputes, and adjudicate prohibited practice charges. I'm going to now briefly further introduce myself and my fellow panelists. So as I said, I'm Sarah Miller Espinosa, and I'm a labor arbitrator, a mediator, a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators, and I also have a part-time appointment at the Scheinman Institute on conflict resolution at Cornell University's ILR school, where I teach classes for conflict resolution professionals and aspiring neutrals. I also serve as a labor relations administrator for a number of jurisdictions in Virginia, as well as Montgomery County Government in Maryland. I'm on the Virginia LERA board, and we'll give you the pitch later about why you should become a member of Virginia LERA if you're not already. Our discussion today is going to focus on best practices and lessons learned as we continue to navigate this historic opportunity to create collective bargaining systems and relationships in Virginia. My fellow panelists today, Amy Smith and Justin Keating, are both heavily involved in Virginia public sector collective bargaining, from the creation of ordinances to representing client interests during elections through collective bargaining and resulting impasse proceedings. Amy Smith is a partner in the law firm of Axelrod. Amy's practice focuses on representing businesses and local governments in all aspects of labor and employment law. Prior to joining Axelrod, Amy practiced both management and employee-side labor and employment law with firms in Savannah, Georgia, and Tampa, Florida. Since the collective bargaining enabling legislation came into effect in May of 2021, Amy has represented several municipalities and school divisions in Virginia in connection with public sector collective bargaining. I also have with us here today Justin Keating. Justin is and has been a shareholder at Beins, Axelrod, and Keating since 2007. Justin is a union-side attorney and practices primarily in traditional labor law, collective bargaining, and employee benefits. Justin previously worked as assistant counsel at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. From 2013 to 2016, Justin served as an elected member of the school board for the city of Alexandria, Virginia. Justin represents private and public sector unions, including unions in a number of Virginia municipalities. Justin also serves as the treasurer of Virginia LERA. So the structure of our conversation today is going to be that we will start by discussing developing collective bargaining ordinances or resolutions. Then we're going to move to elections and bargaining unit determinations, then on to collective bargaining, and then on to impasse proceedings. And I'll just remind you again, please do put your questions in the chat, and I'll be bringing them up with Justin and Amy as we proceed. And so we're going to start with developing those collective bargaining ordinances, considerations to keep in mind, lessons learned, best practices. Amy, we're going to start with you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks everybody for joining in today, and thanks to Sarah and Lyra for the opportunity to speak about this issue, something that we all have been learning a lot about since 2021. So and I'm of course going to speak purely from a management side perspective, and Justin can gleefully disagree with me as we usually do during these panels. He and I have been making the circuit this year. From a management side perspective, a lot of jurisdictions already obviously have their ordinance in place or their resolution. And I will say just at the outset, my experience has been on the general cities and counties, less on the school board side. So I will not speak as much to that. But certainly some of my experience, some of my advice goes for both, obviously. So because we're in a situation, in a jurisdiction where the statute is so bare bones, it only has two aspects in it, two requirements for an ordinance. You have to have procedures for certification and decertification of any exclusive collective bargaining representative. And then you have to avoid restricting any of the governing authority's right, plenary authority. So that pretty much leaves, a whole world of things that you should think about as you're developing an ordinance, including who's going to be allowed to bargain, what kind of units are there going to be, how are you going to trigger an election? There's so many things to think about. So just a basic concept is, how are you going to structure your units? I've had several jurisdictions, both in, the county of Fairfax and city of Charlottesville, both the smallest and the largest jurisdictions involved in collective bargaining. And their units are structured very differently. And I think that that's an important thing to think about for the governing authority. Do you want to have more units? In some ways, that's great because you, can get community of interest in certain units. You've got all your labor and trades people like Justin is involved with, all your public safety people, obviously. On the other hand, then you're dealing with a lot of different agreements all at one time. And if you don't sort of ramp up in a certain way, you can end up negotiating many agreements at one time. So one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is defining who is outside of the bargaining unit, both from a confidential employee perspective and also sort of a supervisory employee perspective. And I know we're going to get into this, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, Sarah, but part of my challenge and lesson learned on this whole process has been defining supervisors, because I really think that that's a key component of both developing the ordinance and then also, figuring out who's going to vote, who's going to be in the unit and that kind of thing. So I think that from my perspective, from a management perspective, the best practice is to follow the NLRA definition of supervisor. There are some ordinances in the state of Virginia that rely on the amount of time that supervisor individual actually is performing supervisory duties, as opposed to what is their most important function to the city, right? So I may not, or city or county or whatever, or school board, I may not spend, 52% of my time supervising people. I may only spend 10% of my time, but that 10% is the most important thing for my employer. That is the most important function that I do for my employer. So from the management side perspective, I think defining supervisors and understanding how those how that definition is going to come into play is one of the most important lessons that I've learned from the management perspective. Justin, I don't know if you have any input on that.
Yeah, the parts I would add are not so much substantive about what the ordinance includes. The one thing that
Yeah.
is sort of stuck in my head as to the experience of working with the counties and cities in drafting the ordinances is what if what I'd recommend to a municipality if they're going to go down this road is think ahead of time about how much involvement you want your elected officials, your city council members, county board members, school board members, how much involvement you want those people to have in the nuts and bolts crafting of the ordinance. Richmond City, their council members had a very active approach in it. They were in touch with the unions, representatives, and so on during the process, which is totally appropriate. It's legislation. Whereas Arlington was much different. In Arlington, the elected leaders, the county board, directed their administration to work with the unions and come up with some legislation, and we did. So they were very different models. There's pros and cons to each. I think if I had my choice, I think the less involvement of the electeds is probably the better way to go. But I would just recommend that you affirmatively think about it ahead of time of which way you want to do it, because there are pros and cons to each one. That's sort of what jumped out at me on that. The supervisory issue. And so in public safety units, it's generally easier to just deal with that in the ordinance because you can draw a cut line at some rank. And I know, so in Charlottesville, it's police officers only, right, Amy?
Yes, that's correct.
Police, yeah. So that's been a bit of an outlier. All the other jurisdictions that have done this for police have done lieutenants and below are covered in the bargaining unit, and for fire, whatever the equivalent of a police lieutenant is. I see our friend Reed Koploff on here. He could probably explain it better for most of them. So that's easier for them. And even for the non-public safety, there hasn't been a whole lot of disputes that I've heard about whether or not certain positions are in or out of the unit. We had some minor ones in Richmond that we sort of, I wouldn't even call it litigated. I would say mini litigated it for the labor and trades unit and the labor relations administrator, the appointed neutral. He hashed it out, made a ruling, and we moved on. So it wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't 5 days of hearing and 20 witnesses per side.
No,
right?
definitely not. But I do think we could have avoided that from a management side perspective if we had defined supervisory as the primary function, as opposed to like relying on a percentage or something like that. Like that's
Yeah. I think there's something to be said for, you go more specific in the ordinance, you maybe forestall litigation later on. But what we came up with wasn't awful. It wasn't a horrible process.
I agree.
I think I was successful in most of my arguments too. So I, of course, think it worked just fine.
Yeah, you really liked how it worked out, but yeah.
So that would be my thoughts on actual ordinance crafting and substance.
I just to piggyback on what you said in terms of having the electeds involved or not, I agree that that's really up to the governing authority as to what they want to have a role in. But I will say one thing is to make sure they get buy-in from the folks who are on the ground. It's sort of who are the, let's talk to the directors of the agencies whose employees are going to be in those units and sort of understand how they've been running the agency and how, what is the supervisory structure and that kind of thing. So I think that that's also important for anybody considering crafting an ordinance or resolution to think about.
Yeah, that'll pay dividends when it comes time to negotiate the contract.
Yes. It'll make it easier for me and you later.
Thank you. Are we ready to move into lessons learned, considerations, any best practices that the two of you have come up with in regard to elections and bargaining unit determinations? Justin, you've already talked a little bit about bargaining unit determinations.
Yeah, I think that's the natural next part of the discussion. And I will say, if somebody has questions or afterwards, or I can stay on late, feel free. If you miss me and you think of something, get in touch with me anytime about any of this stuff. But the big thing about elections that I really was kicking myself over was that we did not, in at least some of them, Richmond in particular, we did not write in a provision for any kind of electronic balloting. It's all mail-in balloting in City of Richmond. I write it off too. It was written during the sort of later stages of the pandemic when we all thought that nobody would ever be meeting again in person and we'd spend the rest of our lives on screens. So it's all mail balloting and that's it. So, either allow for what I would say, if I had to write it again, I would write it so that the LRA can decide on a case-by-case basis how to do the election, whether it be in person, mail-in ballots, or electronic balloting. We've used electronic balloting in a couple of places. I think it's worked fine. So that was a big piece for me about how to actually do the election. Other than that, though, I think, is it Prince William, Amy, has that a majority of the unit has to vote for the union, right?
Correct.
Whereas I think all, or at least most of the other ones have simply a majority of those who cast ballots need to be in favor of the union to authorize representation.
Yes, and I understand that has been controversial, the threshold. But so an interesting tidbit about Virginia collective bargaining history is that, in the pre-1970s or in the 1970s, Arlington County had agreements in place, and they had those thresholds at the time. Like, we had to have 60% of the actual bargaining unit, and I think it was teachers and firefighters and maybe some general employees as well, municipal employees as well. But I think it was primary public safety and teachers. So there is a little bit of precedent for that. The idea of the entire bargaining unit has to vote or meet a threshold to make the election valid. So
yeah, it's the initial threshold and all that. I think in all the ordinances, got to have at least 30%,
right?
30% showing a support that triggers the election, and then they each go a little bit of a different way in terms of what the union needs to get in the election, whether a majority of those voting, is there a minimum threshold?
Right.
Most of them don't have any minimum threshold, just a majority of those voting.
No, it's just like a regular election, like you and I go and vote for whoever's on the ballot or whatever.
Yeah, which is also similar to like NLRA in the private sector.
Correct. Yeah. There are some other states, I think, that have like a regular recertification, process. Like the state of Wisconsin has, like, the union has to be like voted in again every few years, and we don't have anything sort of that drastic in the state of Virginia.
Yeah, Wisconsin and Iowa have really gone the wrong direction, at least obviously from my point of view, in the last few years, which was really sad for Wisconsin, because they were the trailblazers in public sector collective bargaining decades ago. And then
2011 hit and sort of.
Yep.
We got corrected on Prince William, you're right. It was Prince William County Schools, not the county itself. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so none of that here yet. Iowa requires recertifications I think it's every year for some of them. So none of our jurisdictions have done that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't foresee anything like that. But from a practical perspective, talking about elections, we've used Ballot Point in a lot of different, both for electronic and mail, and they have been just phenomenal. Like, very cost effective, easy to work with, very responsive. Like, we had a runoff election in Richmond between the Teamsters and LIUNA, and we had some specific conditions for the election, and they were very responsive to those. And I think that really worked out well. So I would speak highly of them. I think there's like one other vendor that maybe some people have used. But I would say Ballot number one.
Yeah. I've been pleased with them as a vendor.
Yeah, I've worked closely with Ballot Point on elections in Virginia as well, and they have been incredibly responsive.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add on, as someone who's been involved in, actually both of you may have also been involved in all three kinds of elections, right? From the in-person election, which works well if you've got people all in one location or in close locations, right? And is not an overwhelming number of people. So there are some reasons why you might consider an in-person election for some of those smaller units, particularly smaller units who might not use their email as much. And then, the mail ballot, just adding in that extra time to make sure that when people haven't corrected their addresses with their employer, there is time for them to reach out and then get a new ballot mailed to their updated mail address. But for the vast majority of the elections I've been involved in with Ballot Point, it has been the e-ballot, and that is relatively simple. And as the person who gets the messages from people who are having any difficulties or need help with voting, they're relatively few and far between. So.
Yeah, I like the electronic balloting. I think it went well with Ballot Point when we've done it. The only, for a labor and trades unit, which is like what we would call blue collar workers, the people who are spending their day hanging off the back of the garbage truck generally aren't checking their city email. They might not even know they have a city email. So those are the ones where I think electronic balloting probably doesn't work as well. But that's why I like the flexibility built into the ordinance, the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I would say like an in-person is probably most effective for those types of people because they do have to come to the work site every day and they are reporting to the same location and that kind of thing. And then I think even with mail ballots for that, what we ran into in Richmond is that they also, A, they don't check their city email, and then B, also changing their address with the city may not be something that they're used to doing, and it may take them more time and more hassle than they're willing to put into it. And
That's right.
I can't blame them for that. So I think, not only is mail balloting, it takes longer, it costs more, and it also, it ultimately probably results in a lower turnout, I think, most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
The only other note I wanted to add on to bargaining unit determinations is I've noticed that in some of the enabling legislation, there are very short timeframes, right? In terms of when a petition is filed and a showing of interest is made to when the election happens. And so I just caution people that if or as bargaining unit determinations need to be made, the process is sometimes different, right? There needs to be the Labor Relations Administrator who's making those determinations is going to need and require a certain amount of information in order to be able to make them. And sometimes you just need to keep in mind that it has to be built into the process in terms of the timeliness.
Yes. And the advocates need time to write the briefs to the.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, that takes some time too.
Yeah. All right. Are we ready to now, remember everyone, you can put your questions in the chat. Are we ready to move to collective bargaining, negotiating first contracts?
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Justin, you want to start?
Yes. So, these are all first contracts, which means, just like in the private sector, it's first contract. You're starting from scratch. I mean, you're writing provisions about dues check off. You're writing all the legal language things about, savings and separability clauses, duration clauses, everything before you can even get to the sort of substantive stuff. So it simply put, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So there's that piece of it to get ready for. The other things that are coming up sort of preliminarily as you head into negotiations, where there's been maybe some headbutting between parties, is on sort of ground rules for negotiations, including how many people are going to be allowed to be off work to attend negotiations, to attend maybe negotiation preparation sessions with the union. And it's all across the board as to what different counties and cities and, and their respective unions have agreed to. But I think generally all of them have agreed that for joint sessions, there is, I'll say, some reasonable number of employees who are allowed to attend joint negotiating sessions. When I say joint session, I mean that's when we sit down, usually at a big conference table, on one side the union, on the other side management, and actually go back and forth with proposals and ideas. The committee sessions are when each side is meeting on their own to draft up proposals and think up their strategies. I think most of the agreements have been that at joint sessions that can be done on paid for time for the committee members on the union. There's been all over the board as to how many people that could be. Some of that depends on the size of the unit. Maybe it depends on what kind of work they do. So that's sort of the first issue that has to be addressed probably, or one of the early ones that has to be addressed before you even get into the proposals. I have always thought, having done this a few times in Virginia now, we're starting from scratch. And remember, we're dealing with parties here who, for the most part, are made up of people who have never done this before at all. Every now and then you might get somebody like Charlottesville has, I believe he's on here. Jimmy's on here.
Shout out.
We have a labor relations manager who came from Illinois somewhere where he did this. So he has dealt with unions. But a lot of the other people in Virginia on both management and the work side, the worker side, perfectly smart people, good at their jobs, just never done collective bargaining, right? And so, it's a new thing, and it's a thing to kind of struggle with. So I have thought that one of the things I wish I could do a little bit better is to sit at the beginning before I start writing all my brilliant proposals and the union and I approve them and we submit them, is maybe even just sit down with management and talk very generally broad strokes about what we'd like to accomplish, what's important to us, what's not, what the city is worried about. The union can think about how to address that. Before we get into Article 13, Section 1 says that within 90 days, you will blah, blah, blah. Maybe start with a broad stroke discussion, I think would maybe be helpful. That's not something I typically do in the private sector, but I think here in public with first contracts, I think that would be helpful. I'd recommend it. And as I'm saying that out loud, I feel like we should be doing that in some of the ones that Amy and I are currently working on. So I might learn something myself today. So that's kind of what I recommend about negotiations. And, after that, there will be at least one probably session when everybody gets angry at each other and they yell and they maybe say some vulgarities and storm out of the room. And then they come back together the next day and they all apologize and say they're going to do better and so on. And usually they do. And, you just keep going with it.
Not speaking from experience at all. No.
Definitely not.
I just to piggyback on the ground rules thing, I do think that they are important. Sometimes it's hard to reach ground rules, and I do think it's it has been a shock to people outside of Virginia that we are paying for time spent at joint sessions, but I do think that that's been a pretty universal thing here across the board in the state, to my knowledge. I think that everybody, except I think maybe Charlottesville does not. Jimmy, you have to correct me if I'm wrong on that. But the pre-negotiation sessions, Justin, we don't want to pay for the time spent at for those employees. And I think that we've been able to work that out in some localities and some not. And I also think that there's a big difference, as Justin and I are finding out currently, between public safety and other units. I think that public safety is a little bit different because they already have established practices that maybe allow for, different kinds of assignments and different kinds of things, as opposed to like, I'm coming to my desk every day, 9 to 5. And I may not have time to sort of make up time or, outside of my Monday through Friday schedule. So I think that getting those ground rules out, how are we going to treat this time work? How much time is reasonable? We're not going to pay for a week to go and like prepare all your proposals or whatever, but a day or two here and there, that makes sense. I think that having expectations set on both sides, whether you sign the ground rules or not, right? Like even if you can't sign them and you fight about them until kingdom come, but at least you had an idea of how it's supposed to work. That's just my thought on ground rules.
Yeah, and ground rules are something in the private sector we never use. At least I've never used in private sector negotiations. But for whatever reason, long before me, it became a tradition and a culture in public sector. And I'm not looking to change that. It seems to work. I think there's some benefit to it. I was a little skeptical in the beginning, but I think there is benefit.
I have never used them in the private sector, and that's been most of my labor experience for the past 14 years. So
I will say one of the fights that we've had about them, and not just with your jurisdictions, Amy, but others, is about what the parties will agree to of confidentiality of negotiations.
Yes.
And management typically wants an agreement that everything will stay confidential. And my answer is always, that is good practice, but I will not agree to it in writing and sign it. It doesn't do anybody, neither side, good if after every bargaining session, the union goes and tells its 250 members everything that went on in bargaining, and that then so-and-so director of department said stupid things and so on. Because then you end up with a situation when you've got 200 people on your negotiating committee instead of 6. And then it turns into a game of telephone. They start gossiping around the shop and it becomes completely out of control. That said, that's bad practice. But that said, I don't like to agree to confidentiality because I want to be able to keep the door open that if some point down the road, if maybe things aren't going well, the union needs to be able to put it on their Facebook page to members or distribute it, whatever, to talk about how things are going so they can maybe even get some ideas for direction from the membership if they're stumped on something, or if they want to get engaged in membership on what they think about something. So I don't like confidentiality in terms of written agreements, even though as a matter of practice, it's generally the right thing to do. And Amy has probably a very different view of that than I
do. Yeah. Not surprising, but that's okay. So yeah, obviously we do want to keep it confidential because, we know if you immediately go and run, I also want to differentiate between two things. There's one thing if you're, updating your membership as to like what's going on in bargaining. And then there's the other aspect of confidentiality, which is I run straight to the, Channel 5 or whatever, or put it on Facebook. So I think those are two very different things. So if you're just updating your membership, absolutely. You shouldn't, you have to keep them regularly updated so they know that you're actually doing something for them, right? Like, I think that's a very important thing for a union to be able to say is here's all the things that we're striving for as we negotiate this contract. But on the other hand, if you immediately run out and run to the news or, go to Facebook or social media or whatever, that changes the tenor of the negotiations from the employer's perspective, because we know that whatever we give you is automatically going to be public. So we have to think about that in the way we formulate responses to whatever it is that you have requested. So I think that that's the downside of that, right? So, and I understand from a practical perspective why a union would need to do that, right? So maybe they need to go public because they feel like they're not getting the response that they deserve or want or need or whatever. But on the other side of the table, we certainly have to take that into consideration when we're formulating responses. So confidentiality is important from the management perspective. It helps. And it also helps when the union doesn't run immediately to the elected officials, right? And there's the third part of confidentiality. And of course, you can always go and talk to whoever you want to talk to. Nobody can stop you from doing that. And they're obviously your elected officials too. But at the same time, it's hard for them to keep out of it. And I think that frankly, from a nuts and bolts practicality perspective, it is better for them to keep out of it until sort of the end, and then they can be presented with the whole agreement or that kind of thing. But having them in, the minutia of, a day-to-day proposal that affects operations in a particular department is not necessarily conducive to reaching agreement in a quick manner. So that's my 2 cents on confidentiality. Would rather have it than not, but we can get to an agreement without it.
Yeah, and what I'd recommend to the unions anyway that I deal with is, you go to the media or social media or, regular old-fashioned media or not with your stuff is, don't overuse that because, it's going to start to lose its value. And also it does have that effect of it changes when you do that, it changes what goes on at the bargaining table the next day or the next week, whatever it is. I mean,
Absolutely.
These negotiators are human and they're going to be annoyed by it. And that may be part of our strategy to annoy them, but just be aware of and think through what effect it will have. You may think it through and decide you want to do it anyway, and that's fine.
Right.
But I think at least think about the effect that it has. As for the, I got to say in the negotiations I've dealt with, I think there's been very minimal involvement, at least from the union with the elected officials. And the elected officials have, to their credit, been very reluctant to get involved in minutia of collective bargaining of the actual contract negotiations. So that part I've been pleased with.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. In general, it's sort of like they recognize that the day-to-day, nitty gritty of the negotiation should really be left to the administration and the union to figure out what works best. So yeah, I would agree with that.
And let me ask you both to comment on how much time goes into the negotiations, how much time you need to prepare. Some of these timeframes are very short, right? In terms of negotiating a first contract. Can you give me your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would say, in the private sector, when a new contract comes up, I tell the client generally, unless they have an established relationship and there's agreements elsewhere, that it's going to take 18 months at least to negotiate a contract, most likely given schedules and scheduling and, the difficulties involved. And we just don't have that in the public sector because of the budgetary process. Everything's driven by the fiscal year, and that's just not feasible. So everything is just compressed, and you've got, 5 months or 6 months or whatever before the budget process starts. And from the employer's perspective, you may not have your revenue data in time to fully comprehend, what can I pay in light of what the union is asking for. So I think that that's been really a frustrating aspect for many municipalities.
Justin?
As an aside, private sector, 18 months, way too long for first contract. Shouldn't take more than 10. That's maybe another seminar though.
Okay, 10 to 18, whatever, somewhere.
But definitely it's these first contracts, public sector in Virginia, are a way more compressed timeline than I'm used to in private sector, because you have this whole, and this leads into the next part of the discussion today, because you have this whole timeline and it's all centered around, well, the ordinance centers it around the annual budget for the jurisdiction. And that budget's got a date when it has to be submitted by law. And then from there, you start backing up and it has dates and dates and dates and one deadline after another. So you've got to have this collective bargaining process done to fit within those dates. And it really is very compressed. And it's also summertime too. And, stuff is maybe sometimes harder to get people together because of vacations, but it tends to be summertime because it has to lead into a sort of late fall, early winter, like December, January budget preparation time. you know, with the impasse procedures happening in like October and November time period and so on. So yeah, it takes a long time. I mean, when Amy and I did Richmond Police last year, there were a couple weeks in July and August when for 5 days in a row, we either had joint sessions or full days of committee preparations every day. And they were legitimate long work days. They were not 3-hour lunch days. You know, it's a lot of work writing everything from scratch. And in some ways, I think it's even more work than regular private sector, because in private sector, you have 80 years of law that governs what you can and can't negotiate and kind of where to go with things. And, you know, there's a lot of model contracts that sort of, you know, if you're negotiating with a trucking company in Maryland, it's pretty much the same as the one in South Carolina. The law is the same, the industry is the same, a lot of the stuff's going to be the same. But here, it's totally different than anywhere else. And then within each city, it's totally different than the other city next door because they have different ordinance language, which means they might have different things that are non-negotiable management rights sections. And you got to hash those out. And you might have disagreements about what is negotiable and what is not. And you got to go down a different process to resolve that. So there's a lot going on. It is a big lift of time and work.
Yeah.
Amy, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Just that the time on the employer's perspective is sort of, okay, well, what have we been doing, you know, in these areas? And maybe it's sort of getting the general municipality people with the department specific people and getting their calendars aligned and getting an understanding as to what's been done, and what needs to change and what's feasible. So I do think that that's really a hard lift in terms of time as well, in addition to, you know, everybody's regular full-time job that they are already doing. This is collective bargaining on top of that. So I think that's really been a challenge in every jurisdiction that I have assisted with thus far. And that I think nobody really fully understood what a time suck collective bargaining is, that it really does take, you know, it's like a full-time job.
It's, you know, it's a bigger time suck in the first contract than it will be.
Yes, that's true.
Successor contracts. And I think some parties, and I assume there's some on both sides, some parties make it more of a time suck because, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they can't agree on anything. They can't agree on, you know, whether to use all capital letters in the article numbers or use capital and lowercase. You know, I don't really know. You can make this go easier or harder. And each side has a hand in that. You know, I do remind the cities and counties, though, that when their managers, their department directors, police chiefs, whoever are sitting in that room with the union negotiating, that's not in addition to their job. It is part of their job. It has
become part of their job, but you know, they do have other things that they are doing. They had
it is, but it's part of their job.
Happened.
It's part of their job in terms of managing their workforce. You know, I get it's not part of their job in the sense the deputy chief of police is supposed to be out making sure that the streets are being patrolled, but part of his or her job is also to manage the workforce, which is what we're trying to set up a more streamlined process for it. So I feel like you pay a lot at the beginning, you invest a lot of time and effort in the beginning, and it sets you up better off down the road. And not just for 3 years of contract, but sort of starts it perpetually. That's what I'm looking to build.
Yeah. Thank you both. And I'm just going to add on from a neutral perspective, and I know that we're going to be getting into impasse proceedings in a moment, but just in terms of negotiations, and then if you do have to have a neutral come in and make some recommendations or a decision, I know that it can be difficult and that these timelines are set up to end early so that you can build the result into the budget. And I've you know, dealt with jurisdictions who have similar issues in other states. But the later, I'll just say, the more information that the municipality can have about their revenue estimates going into the end before you need to come to that decision point, the better, right? And so I know that sometimes can cause the finance and budget people a little bit of heartburn, but if you have the actual as much information as you can about the revenue estimates, you can just make better decisions. And I know that I know that causes other problems, right? But some of these jurisdictions have picked later dates than others, I think probably for part of that reason.
Yes. Yeah. And I also think it's important to build in a cushion to the extent you can, that to put in the ordinance, and I think most of them have this, that the parties can agree to extend the deadline, to the extent possible, to still take into account the revenue, the budgetary process. And then I think also, like in Richmond, Justin, we ended up making an agreement on the economics and then holding off on a couple of non-economic issues past sort of that budgetary drop dead deadline. And that worked out fine. It took us a while to come to an agreement to that on those issues. But I think that that's also an option if you can come to an agreement on the money, which is typically the hardest part. But you've got some maybe sticking points on other issues. Maybe you can take just those to, impasse proceedings.
Yeah, that ended up working. I don't know how unique of a situation that was. I guess we'll find out. But
Yeah.
once you get all the money stuff done, then the finance people can take care of that and get it into the proposed budget. And in the case of Richmond, we were still haggling about, some things about how to allocate vacation days and stuff like that had nothing to do with the budget. So we had some breathing room to get that done. And we'll get to it in a minute. We went to impasse proceedings. And then after that, there was even post-impasse, a little bit more haggling to get it all resolved.
Yeah.
Okay, so anything else on collective bargaining before we move into lessons learned, considerations, best practices, things you think you'd like to share with everyone regarding impasse proceedings? And I know you've both been involved in jurisdictions where they've had a variety of arrangements, with some nuances.
Mm-hmm.
Amy?
Yeah, I'm happy to go ahead and start on that. So I've been in impasse proceedings in several jurisdictions, mediation pretty much everywhere, and then had some non-binding fact-finding, and then also arbitration. If the municipality is comfortable with arbitration, I think that there are a lot of pros to that, because then a decision is final, it's made. It also is a little uncomfortable because you're putting it in the hands of a neutral as opposed to, the governing body or allowing the municipality to just unilaterally put into place whatever it is that they've decided they want to do. Obviously, from a purely management attorney perspective, I would prefer to have a situation where you go to impasse, you have non-binding mediation, and then we can have some unilateral, putting a place into putting your last proposal in place, but obviously that's not going to fly in many jurisdictions. I would say that the non-binding fact finding with the results going to the governing body is tricky, just from a political perspective, because then, again, you're having your electeds involved in maybe a dispute that involves a very technical issue, or maybe it's wages, or maybe it's whatever, but then they have to publicly have that that presentation before them and make a decision. I will say there are I've spoken with some other, some HR folks from other states, and they have situations where the impasse proceedings go before the governing body, but in executive session, in closed session. So I have not seen that in Virginia, and maybe that's an option that could still involve the governing body, but have it not necessarily public to everyone, but the union and the administration could be involved. Yeah, I think impasse it's also time compressed because you're ending up in the fall, winter time frame right before the budget process is happening, and that lends itself into a lot of scheduling issues. It's also very difficult, I'm sure Sarah can speak to this, to find a neutral who has availability. Like, there's just not a lot of people available. We ran into that in pretty much every place I've represented, is that they're few and far between, and they're busy folks. So,
Justin, thanks,
yeah,
Amy.
Heading into impasse, one thing that's maybe rewind a little bit is, so when an LRA gets appointed, he or she will issue LRA rules of procedure, and one of the things that'll cover is sort of putting some flesh on the bones of impasse proceedings. The ordinance will cover it more generally, and the LRA rules will cover it more detail. And an important part of that is how last best offers are going to be made and how they're going to be picked by the whatever it might be, fact finder or arbitrator.
Yeah.
And so generally, the way I like it is LRA rules leave some room for flexibility again, so that each set of parties can decide kind of what makes sense for them. And if they can't agree on it, then the LRA or the appointed fact finder, I think, could decide for them. But the issue is, okay, most of us agree that it's last best final offers and the fact finder has to pick one or the other, baseball style arbitration. He or she can't split the difference. And the effect of that is that it encourages parties to get reasonable real quick as they prepare their last best finals. Because you could be worried if I go too crazy, I'm going to get stuck with the other one, with the opposing side. So the point that would have to be resolved ahead of time, though, is whether or not the arbitrator or fact finder is going to pick one side or the other's entire package of LBOs, or is he or she going to go like article by article on the LBOs? I like the unions better for Article 12, but I'm going to pick the cities for Article 15 and so on, or is it a package thing? There's, again, pros and cons to each of them that I think you could talk about and you should think about, and kind of what makes the most sense for you, and what will, I think if your ultimate goal is to what gets me more likely to get to a negotiated deal, then that should be the one you take. And so then with the actual impasse proceedings, so, you know, in Arlington, we went to impasse for the police and we did not mediate at all. And we did a 3-day hearing, tons of evidence. The arbitrator issued a decision. Up there, they have binding for non-economic stuff. Issued a decision. Each side got some of what they wanted. In Richmond, with the police there, we ended up we had appointed, jointly agreed to Sarah as the fact finder. We ended up turning the fact finding schedule into mediation. It was successful, 3 long days. It got all the economic issues worked out, a lot of the others. So I think that was very fruitful. That was a good idea if you think your parties can handle it and that they'll respond well to it, but not all of them will. The ones in Richmond, it did work well. And then we still had to go to impasse hearing over some, you know, a few dangling issues, non-economic stuff like we talked about. But those are the kind of things that I would recommend thinking about as you head into impasse proceedings. Oh yeah, one more is, so all the ordinances have a piece that to come up with compensation, wage and benefits, you look at comparable jurisdictions and what they're providing. So for police and fire, that's relatively easy. You know, if you're in Arlington, we're going to compare it to what firefighters in Arlington make versus what they make in Fairfax County or in Prince William and so on. With the non-public safety, it gets a little bit more complicated, but I think it would be great for everybody involved if going into, maybe even into negotiations, but definitely going into impasse, try to agree on what your comparables are, or else you're going to get to the impasse hearing and one side thinks the only comparables are the 2 adjacent counties, and the other side is bringing up Riverside, California, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and they might have really good arguments for why those are good comparisons, but it would be a heck of a lot easier for everybody involved if we could agree on what the comparables are. You know, so that's what I would recommend. That's a little bit of a pie in the sky, but I think it's at least worth trying. Maybe agree on some of them. We agree on these 3, and there's others that we don't agree on, but that's better than nothing.
Amy, do you want to add to that? Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Some ordinances have specifically that you have to look at comparators in Virginia. I think it depends on the ordinance, sort of what's your governing document. Also, part of the impasse process is fighting about who the comparators are, right? Like, I think that's sort of when you get to the hearing, sort of the whole part of your whole argument is, well, no, we shouldn't look at those people because the law is different or whatever. You know, we ended up with a lot of that in Fairfax County impasse proceedings. So I think that that's part and parcel of the whole thing, is fighting about who your comparators are and using comparators in a way that, you know, if I'm the union, that's helpful to me. If I'm the employer, it's helpful to the employer. And I think that that's part of the neutral's role, is to sort of figure out, you know, who are the proper comparators and how should I look at them and how should I weigh that in consideration in midst of all these other factors that might be involved. So maybe the way my advice is better interpreted is, if you think of the idea, if you get to interest, you're heading towards interest arbitration, you want to narrow as much of the disputes as you can. If one of the disputes you can narrow is what we're even comparing to, yeah, that would be a small victory. That would be good. Yeah.
But you know, I mean, look, I'd like to narrow all of them and then we get a deal and we're all happy. And
right.
Except for, you know, the arbitrators who make money doing these.
We actually would like you to,
yeah,
would like you to settle.
They'll find work somewhere else. I'm confident of that. But that's sort of, you know, in general, the goal is narrow the issues before interest arbitration. So that could be one, maybe fertile ground for narrowing.
Yeah, and in my experience, I think that as time goes on and in Virginia, in each of these jurisdictions, as you have more and more negotiations and, if necessary, fact finder reports or interest arbitration awards, there's going to be some precedent for what you're using as the comparables, right? And so at some point you may be arguing around the edges, but it's pretty much been determined after a while. You'll be set in terms of what the appropriate comparables are. I'd also just say, you know, and as a reminder for anyone who's listening, in some of the procedures that have been established by some LRAs, there are actual deadlines to try to force the parties to pick their neutrals earlier, so that you can't, understanding and recognizing that, you know, there's a limited subset and everybody's going to be looking at the same time. So to try to lock people in. Sometimes, you know, people take that guidance and sometimes they don't, but I just have you all keep that in mind. All right. Do we have any questions? And I'll give people a minute to add in the chat, and then I'll go to, you know, Amy and Justin, do you have any last words while we're waiting to see if there are any questions on best practices and takeaways for people to consider?
One thing that I think is going to start coming up is midterm negotiations and sort of how do we have to deal with that. And it's obviously going to differ jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And if the parties address it negotiating their first agreement, obviously, and if it's spelled out in the agreement, that's going to govern. But if it's not, sort of what do you have to do? Do you have to use your impasse procedures? How is that going to work? Is there a status quo obligation? Obviously, yes. I mean, but what kind of status quo obligation? If there's a step increase, do you have to keep is it like the dynamics status quo or is it static status quo? What's the process going to be? So that's something I'm sort of been thinking about as we're negotiating these agreements, but also sort of, you know, something that I think is going to come into play after July 1 of this year, and maybe already has come into play in jurisdictions that I'm not involved in that already have agreements in place.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but it raises a good point. Maybe I've kept my, willful blindness. I've kept my head in the sand about not wanting to think about how we deal with it. You know, but I always say, I mean, to some extent or another, maybe to a point when you're talking about midterm impasse like Amy is, but to some extent or another, in the public sector, I always say we're always negotiating. Always. It doesn't end. It doesn't only negotiate every 3 years. It's always negotiating in a way that the private sector just doesn't do. Labor relations there. So we're always trying to work something out. You know, it's much more dynamic. Is that the word? I think than private sector. In some ways, in some really big ways, like in Arlington, they did some stuff after the contract was done, some pretty substantial changes that made sense for everybody. And we did it. And I don't see it as, oh my God, all that negotiation and impasse was a waste of time. No, it sort of informed how it is that we got to what the parties eventually realized they could agree on, you know? It's all part of the process.
Absolutely. Well, I am not seeing any questions in our chat. So what I am going to do is give people one more minute to see if you have a question, but I'm also going to give you a couple of reminders, right? So if you are not a member of Virginia LERA, you should consider becoming a member of Virginia LERA because among other things, you'll have access to the recordings of all our virtual sessions and meetings, including this one, if you're a member. So we'd encourage you to think about becoming members of Virginia LERA, and also, again, the conference is scheduled in person on Tuesday, September 10th in Richmond. Okay. Justin and Amy, thank you both so much for spending this time today with Virginia LERA, and we wish everybody a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gonna see if I can stop the recording.